The wet snow was falling slowly, as if hesitating, wondering whether it was even worth settling on the frozen ground. The dog sat under an old, leaning fence, curled up tightly. His fur, once thick and warm, was now matted and no longer provided the same warmth. He knew that if he fell asleep now, he might never wake up. But his strength was leaving him. He was born in a small yard, in a secluded corner between a shed and a brick wall. His mother, warm and caring, licked each of her puppies, pressing them close to her. The first weeks were filled with comfort, his mother's milk, the soft warmth of his brothers and sisters, the familiar sense of home. Then a man came. He examined the puppies, said something, and then took them away one by one. He was taken too, wrapped in a soft towel, and carried away. The house was warm and spacious. He had his own place, a bowl of food, and toys. He grew up playing with children, running through the garden. They petted him, called him by name, and he loved to nuzzle his snout into their warm hands. But then the children grew up, the games became less frequent, and eventually stopped altogether. One day, they simply took him far away and left him on the street. He waited for a long time, thinking they would come back, but no one did. So he set off to find them himself. Just yesterday, he was running through the streets, looking into the eyes of passers-by, hoping someone would recognize him, that someone would remember he once had a home, a warm spot by the radiator, and a gentle voice calling his name. But people walked past him. Some turned away, some clutched their bags tighter and quickened their pace, and one boy even threw a stone at him. He didn't feel hurt. He just realized once again that now, he was no one. The night was cold, but the morning brought the scent of something familiar. With great effort, he lifted his head, catching the faint aroma of meat. And then he heard a voice, warm, gentle, with a hint of worry. "Poor thing. You're so cold, aren't you?" Thin hands carefully touched his head, and he whimpered softly, whether from fear or surprise, it was unclear. The eyes looking at him were kind, large, full of compassion. The girl took off her scarf and wrapped it around his neck, but she couldn't lift him, he was too big. She took him home, gave him a warm place to stay and food to eat. He ate slowly, cautiously, as if afraid someone would take the bowl away. For the first few days, he barely moved from the corner, watching her from under his brows. When she left, he became anxious, paced around the room, sometimes whimpered, but didn't dare approach the door. The first time she tried to take him outside, he froze at the threshold. The snowy wind hit his face, and he stepped back. Out there, only pain awaited him. He remembered the cold, the hunger, the stones, and the indifferent looks. She didn't rush him, she just stood beside him, speaking softly and calmly. Several minutes passed before he gathered the courage to take a step forward. The first walks were short. He looked around tensely, flattened his ears, flinched at every loud sound. But with each passing day, he trusted her more. He felt her warm hand on his head, heard her gentle voice that reassured him. Gradually, fear faded, giving way to a new feeling, a feeling that, at last, there was someone who cared about him. Sometimes, when he lay in his warm little corner, he sank into memories as if into a distant dream. In those dreams, the cozy yard where he was born seemed familiar again, along with the scents that filled the air, earth, grass, fresh wind. He saw his mother gently licking his face, felt the warmth of her body and the laughter of his brothers and sisters. In those dreams, he was once again a small puppy who didn't yet know that one day he would be taken away and abandoned in a strange world. He dreamed of that home where there were many people, where he was loved, where he had his own corner and a place he called his own. In those moments, he forgot about the cold, pain, and fear that had become part of his life after he was left on the street. Everything felt so real, so close, the things he had lost no longer seemed so far away. But when he woke up, reality came crashing down on him again. The spot by the radiator, where it was warm and cozy, was in the past. Now, there was only this small room and this person who took care of him. He couldn't allow himself to forget that he was not home, that this life was not the one he was used to. But with each passing day, those memories grew dimmer, like old photographs that lose their color over time. And then, once more, he felt the warmth of her hand, her gentle voice, and in that moment, he knew that maybe, not everything was lost. In those rare moments of peace, when she sat beside him, speaking to him softly, he forgot everything. He forgot the past, the pain, and the loneliness. He knew only one thing, that here, now, there was someone who would not abandon him, someone who would not leave, someone who would stay by his side. A few weeks passed, and with each day, his world grew a little bigger. The girl continued to care for him, and gradually, he began to trust her. But one day, when she decided to take him for a walk in the park, he realized that there was more to the world than just her, there were other beings as well. There were other dogs running through the green grass, playing with children and their owners. At first, he was wary, standing close to the girl, hesitant to approach. He knew the world could be dangerous, and not all dogs were kind. But soon, a large, fluffy dog approached them, black and white, with bright eyes that sparkled in the sunlight like two tiny suns. He came closer with a friendly caution, and when the girl saw that it was safe, she let them meet. "This is Bars," she said as the dog stood beside him, sniffing his muzzle. "He's here almost every day." Bars looked confident, but there was a certain softness in his eyes, as if he sensed that this wasn't just any stray dog, this was someone in need of help. He licked his ears and then jumped back playfully, as if inviting him to join in a game. At first, he didn't know what to do. His past experiences with other dogs were filled with pain and fear, but this dog was different. Bars ran up to him again, and this time, he gathered a little courage, got up on his paws, and cautiously stepped forward. They started playing, clumsily running through the grass, exchanging glances, and little by little, he felt the tension fade away. Bars became his friend. After that day, they met regularly. Bars taught him how to play with other dogs, how not to be afraid to walk through the park. There were other friends too, a small, cheerful, and curious dog named Napka, and an old dog named Petre, with whom they often sat on a bench, watching the world go by. Petre, with his graying whiskers and wise eyes, seemed calm and experienced. He told many stories about life on the streets, about how important it was to find strength within oneself and never lose hope. Each time they met, he felt the world around him becoming less hostile. He realized that not all dogs, just like not all people, were indifferent and cruel. Some could become loyal friends who would never betray or abandon him. The girl noticed how his eyes began to shine when he met his new friends. And although he hadn't completely forgotten his past, he felt that his life was changing. He was no longer alone. There was a place for him in this world, and perhaps, it wasn't as bad as he had once thought. One late evening, while they were walking through the park, two strangers suddenly emerged from the shadows. They came too close, and one of them unexpectedly started pushing the girl, as if trying to grab her attention. The dog felt his protective instinct awaken instantly. At first, he stood cautiously beside her, watching as these people invaded his owner's personal space. But when one of the strangers raised his hand to shove the girl even harder, the dog could stay silent no longer. He let out a deep, threatening growl, his tail raised high, and his fur bristling like a tightly wound spring. He lunged forward, standing between the girl and the strangers, ready to protect her at any cost. His eyes sparkled with determination, and the vicious snarl he released echoed through the quiet park. The strangers froze, noticing the threat, hesitating for a moment as they tried to decide what to do. "Leave," one of them finally said, and realizing that the dog was prepared to attack, they quickly retreated, unwilling to take the risk. The dog didn't move from the girl's side until they disappeared from sight, and only then did he start to relax, still watching the empty path for a few moments. The girl bent down and stroked his head, smiling gratefully. The dog calmed down slightly in response, but he remained close, ready to protect her if necessary. In that moment, he understood, he was no longer alone. He had someone to protect, someone who needed him. When they returned home, the atmosphere was warm and peaceful. The girl closed the door behind her, and the dog, still trembling slightly from what had happened, let out a sigh of relief. She walked over to the kitchen table, opened the fridge, and took out a piece of meat, carefully cutting it into small pieces. Her eyes, still filled with worry, looked at the dog with gratitude and care. "You saved me," she said softly, leaning toward him. "I don't even know what I would have done without you." The dog, catching the scent of the meat, perked up but didn't rush to eat it. He looked at her with gratitude in his eyes, feeling her attention and warmth. In that moment, he understood that he was no longer alone. She wasn't just saving him, she was making him part of her life. The girl placed a piece of meat on the floor, and without waiting for her permission, he eagerly pounced on the food. He ate slowly, savoring the taste and the feeling of having a place where he was valued. This was a sign that his life was changing. He was no longer just a stray dog, he was part of this family. And that piece of meat was more than just food, it was a token of gratitude for everything she had done for him. After that night when the dog protected his owner, an even stronger bond formed between them. He never left her side, carefully watching her every move and becoming alert at the slightest suspicious sound. One morning, as the girl was getting ready for a walk, the dog rushed to the door first, as if reminding her that he would always be by her side now. Outside, the snow sparkled in the sunlight, the air was crisp, and the city was just beginning to wake up. This time, they decided to walk through the park. It was quiet there, with only a few passers-by walking their dogs or hurrying about their day. The dog felt calmer than before. He no longer flinched at every rustle, no longer pinned his ears back, he walked beside her, confident and proud. In the park, they met a woman with a small, red-haired dog wagging its tail cheerfully. "What a beautiful dog you have," the woman said with a smile. The girl patted her companion on the head and replied, "He's not just beautiful, he's a real hero." The woman crouched down and reached out her hand, but the dog still watched strangers cautiously. He knew the world could be cruel, but with this girl by his side, he felt like he was learning to trust again. And so, his new life began, a life filled with kind people, warmth, and friendship. The dog saw the cat instantly, a small black figure darting across the sidewalk, barely touching the ground. His instincts took over. He bolted, racing after it at full speed. The girl shouted his name, but it was too late. The cat slipped across the road, and he followed. At that moment, the sharp screech of brakes pierced the air, loud and desperate. The impact was sudden. The car braked, but it couldn't stop in time. The dog collapsed onto the asphalt, his body sliding forward helplessly, and then, silence. The girl ran to him, her breath catching in fear. He lay on his side, breathing heavily, his legs trembling slightly. His eyes were filled with confusion, as if he himself didn't understand what had just happened. "No," she whispered, sinking to her knees. "Hold on, please." The driver rushed out of the car, looking around in distress. "Is he alive?" he asked, his voice filled with guilt. The girl didn't answer. She gently ran her hand over the dog's head, feeling his ears trembling. He whimpered, trying to move, but pain shot through his body. "You'll be okay," her voice wavered. "Just hold on, I'll call for help." She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the vet's number. Her heart was pounding wildly, but she knew one thing, she wouldn't leave him. Not now. Not ever. The girl didn't remember how it all happened. Everything was a blur. People around her, frightened faces, distant voices, the noise of cars, but all she could hear were his quiet, barely audible whimpers. The dog tried to lift his head, but his strength had left him. His eyes, once so full of life, had grown dull, clouded with pain and confusion. He didn't understand what had happened, why his body wouldn't obey him, why his legs could no longer hold him up. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here." Her voice trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she kept stroking him between the ears, trying to warm him, to comfort him. Passers-by helped. A man lifted him under his front legs, while another supported his hindquarters. They carefully picked him up, doing their best not to cause him more pain. "Do you have a car?" one of them asked, breathing heavily. "No. No," the girl frantically looked around. And then, suddenly, she heard. "I'll take you." A car stopped right next to them. The woman behind the wheel was already opening the door, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Hurry," the girl shouted. They carefully laid him on the back seat. The dog whimpered softly as the car started moving. His breathing was heavy, uneven, his paw twitched in a weak attempt to move. "Hold on, do you hear me? You're strong," she whispered, unable to hold back her tears. "Just don't close your eyes. Please." He looked at her, using the last of his strength to take in her scent, the scent of home, warmth, safety. The scent of the only person who had ever needed him. As they pulled into the veterinary clinic's driveway, he closed his eyes. "No. Don't you dare. Don't leave me." She felt her heart shatter. People rushed out of the clinic, stretchers, hands, commotion, voices. "He's still breathing. Get him to surgery, now." The doors closed before her. And inside, a piece of her soul remained. The girl stood in front of the closed doors, clenching her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Her body trembled, out of cold, fear, helplessness. One word echoed in her mind: live. She slowly slid down the wall, sitting on the cold tiled floor, staring into emptiness. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't even try to wipe them away. Every minute felt like an eternity. Voices came from behind the door, someone shouting commands, the clatter of equipment, hurried footsteps. Too much blood loss. Painkillers, now. Pressure is dropping. The voices turned into a dull roar, piercing her like a deep, throbbing pain. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. A tight knot seemed to be tearing apart inside her chest. "Please," she whispered, clasping her hands together in a desperate prayer. "Please, save him." The veterinarian stepped out, closing the door behind him. His face was tense. The girl jumped to her feet, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. Is he alive?" Her voice broke into a whisper. The doctor ran a hand over his forehead and let out a heavy sigh. "We're doing everything we can. But his condition is critical." He paused, looking at her with a long, sympathetic gaze. "Will he make it?" Her lips trembled. The vet looked away. "I don't know. Right now, the most important thing is that he doesn't." She covered her ears with her hands. She didn't want to hear it. She couldn't even bear the thought of losing him. She didn't notice when she sank back to the floor, curling into herself, sobbing uncontrollably. If only I had kept him on the leash. If only he hadn't chased that cat. If only. But, if only wouldn't save him. Only hope could. Only a miracle. Oh God, help us, please let my dog live. I'll do anything, just let him survive. The girl sat on the cold floor, her hands clenched into fists, her lips silently repeating a prayer. Please, please, let him live. Tears burned her eyes, and despair tightened her chest. Time seemed to stand still. She stared at the closed door, behind which a battle for the life of her only, loyal friend was being fought. If only I could take his pain away, if only I could give him my warmth. The door finally opened. The veterinarian stepped out, his face weary, but there was hope in his eyes. "He's stabilized. We've managed to stop the bleeding, but the night will be crucial." The girl nodded, covering her mouth with her hand to keep from breaking down. "Can I see him?" The doctor sighed, then nodded. "Only for a short time." She entered the room. The dog lay on a soft bed, his paw bandaged, with 4 drips nearby. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes, his warm, familiar eyes, looked at her. "Baby," she whispered, kneeling beside him, gently touching his ear. "You'll make it, you hear me? You can't leave me." The dog slightly wagged his tail, barely noticeable, but that was enough to make the tears fall down her cheeks again. "I'm with you, always." The following days were the longest of her life. She didn't leave the clinic, sitting in the hallway, trembling from exhaustion and worry. They brought her tea, and some of the staff offered her to rest, but she just shook her head. Every time the doctor came out, her heart would stop. "He's fighting," the doctor said on the second day. "There's a reaction to the treatment, but he's very weak." She nodded, gripping her fingers until it hurt. On the third day, the dog was able to lift his head. She saw his gaze, tired, but alive. "My good boy," she whispered, gently touching his muzzle. On the 4th day, he tried to stand, but collapsed back down. She held his paw, whispering words of encouragement. "You're strong. You'll make it." On the 5th day, the doctor smiled for the first time. "He's getting better." She cried, this time not from fear, but from relief. A week later, he was already trying to stand, though unsteadily. She helped him, supported him, and brought him his favorite food. 2 weeks later, he walked outside with her. Slowly, carefully, but on his own. "Good boy," she whispered, kneeling beside him and hugging him. The dog nudged her shoulder with his nose. His tail twitched. He survived. They made it. Together. The world remained the same, bustling, indifferent, noisy. People hurried on with their business, passing by without noticing either her or him. But for the two of them, everything had changed forever. Now they were no longer alone. When she woke up in the mornings, the first thing she felt was his steady, warm breath beside her. She reached out her hand, touching his soft fur, and he would open his eyes, lazily wagging his tail. "Good morning, my dear," she whispered, and he would yawn, stretch, and gently rub his nose against her palm. They no longer feared the future. It didn't matter, as long as they were together. When she left the house, he waited for her at the door, his ears pressed back, but knowing she would always return. And when she came back, he greeted her with such joy, as if he hadn't seen her in 1,000 years. They walked through the snow-covered streets, and she smiled, watching him run ahead, kicking up fluffy snowdrifts. He was alive. He was happy. In the evening, when the city sank into silence, they sat together, wrapped in a blanket. She read aloud, running her fingers through his fur, and he lay with his head in her lap, listening to her voice. Now, there was no emptiness in her life. They had found each other in the coldest, most merciless world. They had saved each other. And in that simple, warm happiness, there was everything they needed.